American submarines made up roughly 2% of the entire U.S. Navy during World War II. By the war's end, that 2% had sunk more than half of all Japanese shipping losses combined, over 7 million tons, a wildly disproportionate contribution from a weapon most naval planners had regarded, at the war's outset, as a purely defensive tool, best kept close to home and out of harm's way. A huge part of how that changed traces back to one man who was, by his own Navy's early judgment, too timid and too conservative to command a submarine at all, and who was given a second real chance largely, by his own commanding officer's account, because of how firmly the man shook his hand during a single meeting. Everything that follows is drawn from official Navy records, the Naval History and Heritage Command, the U.S. Naval Institute's own published historical analysis, and multiple corroborating accounts of the men and ships involved. This story includes a genuinely serious wartime controversy involving significant loss of life, which I'll present plainly and with appropriate care, rather than gloss over or treat lightly, as some retellings of this story unfortunately have. Dudley Walker Morton was born July 17, 1907, in Owensboro, Kentucky, and grew up between Kentucky and Miami, Florida, where he attended high school and became something close to the archetypal all-American teenager, athletic, popular, a standout wrestler good enough to nearly make the 1932 Olympic team. He entered the Naval Academy at Annapolis in 1926, where classmates gave him the nickname Mushmouth, later shortened simply to Mush, after a large-jawed character from the newspaper comic strip Moon Mullins, whose face reportedly resembled his own. Morton graduated and was commissioned an ensign in 1930, and over the following decade served aboard the carrier USS Saratoga, the cruiser USS Chicago, and eventually volunteered for submarine duty in 1933, developing along the way a reputation as a talented officer who had little patience for rigid, by-the-book military formality. While stationed in Manila, he met and married an American art student named Harriet Nelson, and the couple went on to have 2 children together, a son and a daughter, in the years leading up to the war. By 1940, Morton had earned his first submarine command, an aging World War I-era boat called the R-5, barely capable of modern combat. When America entered the war after Pearl Harbor, Morton and the R-5 got an early, humbling taste of combat against a modern German U-boat in the Atlantic, one of the most sophisticated submarines afloat at the time, facing off against a nearly obsolete American relic. Morton fired 4 torpedoes that all missed, then dove to escape a fight his outdated, outmatched submarine had no real chance of winning against a far more capable adversary. Some officers privately questioned whether Morton had simply been too cautious, whether a more aggressive commander might have pressed the engagement rather than retreating. His chain of command, giving him something close to the benefit of the doubt, promoted him to lieutenant commander and sent him to submarine tactics school to prepare him for command of a more modern boat instead of ending his career in submarines outright. What Morton found at that school frustrated him deeply. Prevailing doctrine at the time treated submarines almost entirely as defensive scouts, meant to avoid risk and fire only when a shot was close to guaranteed safe, rather than actively hunt enemy shipping the way Morton believed the weapon was actually capable of doing. Morton wanted something closer to underwater guerrilla warfare, aggressive, sustained attacks aimed squarely at crippling Japanese supply lines across the entire Pacific, regardless of the personal risk involved. He kept his opinions mostly to himself throughout the course, since nobody with real authority was interested in hearing them from an officer whose own record already had a mark of excessive caution against it, an irony that clearly wasn't lost on him at the time. After school, rather than the modern Gato-class fleet submarine he'd hoped for, Morton was assigned to the USS Dolphin, an aging, barely seaworthy boat that had already lost the ability to fire torpedoes and was reduced to little more than an anti-aircraft platform armed with a pair of deck guns. Morton pushed back hard against the assignment, arguing openly that the ship was little better than a death trap, and his direct commanding officer responded by accusing him of cowardice again and trying to have him removed from submarine duty entirely, reassigned to a surface ship instead. The matter went all the way up to Captain John Babe Brown, the senior officer overseeing Morton's fate, who ultimately decided to give Morton one more chance, not immediately as a commander, but as an officer assigned to a new fleet boat just arriving in the Pacific, the USS Wahoo. Brown's own explanation for the decision, on record afterward, was refreshingly simple. He liked the way Morton shook his hand. Morton reported to the Wahoo under its commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Marvin Pinky Kennedy, a former surface ship officer new to submarine command entirely, nicknamed for his red hair and pale complexion, and quickly bonded with the ship's executive officer, Lieutenant Richard Dick O'Kane, a submariner with far more actual undersea experience than Kennedy had ever accumulated. Kennedy's caution bordered on the absurd. Distrusting the Wahoo's newly installed water distillers, which existed specifically to keep the boat's batteries supplied with fresh water, while also letting the crew shower and do laundry, he banned their use entirely over fuel consumption concerns, forcing the crew to collect drinking and washing water from air conditioner condensation drips instead, despite the Navy having spent considerable money installing equipment specifically meant to eliminate that exact problem. Kennedy also insisted on keeping 2 officers on the bridge at all times regardless of conditions, running his exhausted junior officers down to 4 hours of sleep a night, even when no enemy contact was in sight. Across the Wahoo's second war patrol, Kennedy repeatedly ordered the boat to dive and lose contact with Japanese convoys, rather than risk a surface approach, even in conditions, heavy rain, rough seas, that would have concealed an attack almost perfectly. O'Kane grew furious watching genuine opportunities slip away, on one occasion successfully sinking a freighter almost by accident, despite trying to micromanage every station on the boat personally, rather than trusting his more experienced officers, then refusing to press the advantage against the rest of the convoy out of excessive caution. On another occasion, with a Japanese ship sitting dead in Wahoo's sights, Kennedy refused to fire at all, reportedly citing a technicality about whose patrol sector the target belonged in, a decision that nearly provoked O'Kane into open confrontation on the bridge. When the patrol ended, and Vice Admiral Charles Lockwood directly asked Morton for his honest assessment of Kennedy's performance, Morton didn't soften it. He called Kennedy unfit for command. Kennedy was relieved. On December 31st, 1942, in Brisbane, Australia, Dudley Morton took command of the USS Wahoo. Morton wasted no time remaking the boat in his own image. He threw out Kennedy's disciplinary logbook, put up pin-up posters throughout the submarine, and had placards printed reading simply, "Shoot the sons of bitches," posted in every compartment where the crew would see them. He told the crew to drop his rank entirely and just call him Mush, a small gesture that mattered enormously aboard a boat where officers and enlisted men lived in cramped, constant proximity for weeks at a time. Before departing on the Wahoo's third war patrol, his first as commanding officer, he gave his men a direct choice. Anyone who didn't want to volunteer for what was coming could transfer off with zero judgment attached, no questions asked, no black mark on their record. Nobody took him up on it. Morton made one particularly unusual change immediately. Rather than personally manning the periscope himself, the traditional role of any submarine captain and a position no commander before him had willingly handed off, he had O'Kane take that job instead, freeing himself to absorb reports from sonar, radar, and targeting simultaneously, and make decisions based on the full tactical picture rather than a single narrow view through a scope. It was an unprecedented level of trust in his junior officers for the era, and by every account, it worked exactly as Morton hoped it would. The Wahoo's third patrol, launched January 16, 1943, became arguably the single most successful submarine war patrol of the entire war to that point. Assigned what was meant to be a relatively low-risk reconnaissance mission into Wewak Harbor, a heavily defended Japanese hub off New Guinea that Allied planners had almost no reliable maps of, one of Morton's own crewmen solved the intelligence problem almost by accident. A children's geography atlas he'd bought in Australia as a souvenir turned out to contain more detailed, more accurate charts of the harbor than anything the U.S. Navy had on file, and an amateur photographer aboard the boat helped combine the two into a usable new map. Mission technically accomplished before they'd even fired a shot, Morton decided reconnaissance alone wasn't enough. Sailing brazenly on the surface into the harbor itself at high speed, reasoning that the shallow water there would let Japanese aircraft spot a submerged submarine just as easily as a surfaced one anyway. Morton sank a Japanese destroyer at close range, then went on to engage and sink an entire unescorted convoy, 2 freighters, and a large troop transport, the Buyo Maru, over the following days. It's here that the Wahoo's record includes its most serious and lasting controversy. After sinking the Buyo Maru, Morton found the water around the wreck filled with roughly 20 lifeboats carrying survivors, troops from a Japanese army unit, though it later became clear that some of the men aboard had actually been Indian prisoners of war from the 16th Punjab Regiment, captured earlier in the fighting at Singapore, and being transported as POWs rather than active combatants at all. Believing these were Japanese reinforcements bound for New Guinea, who would otherwise be picked up by another vessel and go on to fight American Marines there, Morton ordered the Wahoo's deck guns to open fire on the lifeboats themselves. Some survivors returned fire with small arms as the submarine approached, which Morton and later Navy defenders cited as justification for continuing the engagement rather than breaking it off. By the time it ended, roughly 282 men were dead. Historical accounting puts that specifically at 195 Indian prisoners of war and 87 Japanese soldiers, meaning the clear majority of the dead that day were Allied prisoners rather than enemy combatants at all. The U.S. Navy investigated afterward and ultimately took no disciplinary action, treating the incident as a defensible decision made under the ambiguous, brutal logic of unrestricted submarine warfare doctrine already in effect against Japan since virtually the first day of the war. Japan's own wartime propaganda seized on the incident regardless, using it to paint American submariners broadly as war criminals. Whatever the full moral accounting of that single day looks like in hindsight, it followed Morton for the rest of his career, and, by the account of his own executive officer O'Kane, is the specific reason Morton was never nominated for the Medal of Honor, despite an otherwise extraordinary combat record that, by pure numbers, arguably justified one. The Wahoo's third patrol still ended in historic success by the Navy's own standards. 5 confirmed ships sunk in 23 days, against an average patrol length of roughly 70, an efficiency rate that stunned even seasoned submarine officers back at Pearl Harbor, and the boat sailed back into Pearl Harbor on February 7, 1943, flying a broom lashed to its periscope, the traditional naval signal for a clean sweep. Morton and the crew, briefly, became genuine wartime celebrities, granted interviews and photographs in a way almost unheard of for a service that operated almost entirely in silence and secrecy. Nicknamed at the time simply the Silent Service, Morton received the Navy Cross and the Army's Distinguished Service Cross for the patrol, and the Wahoo itself received a Presidential Unit Citation, a rare joint honor that underscored just how badly the Navy needed a genuine morale-boosting success story that early in the Pacific War. Morton's aggression only intensified from there. On the Wahoo's fourth patrol, into the shallow, heavily trafficked Yellow Sea in March 1943, the boat sank, or damaged roughly 9 vessels in a matter of days, a run so disruptive that Japanese forces reportedly concluded an entire American wolf pack, rather than a single submarine, had to be operating in the area. During that same patrol, Morton also got his first chance to test a newer explosive filler called Torpex, reportedly about 50% more powerful than the standard TNT charge, sinking one target with a single torpedo rather than the usual spread. Morton earned a second Navy Cross for that patrol, and O'Kane a Silver Star. Throughout, the crew battled constant failures with America's early war Mark 14 torpedoes, which frequently ran too deep, detonated prematurely, or simply failed to explode on contact at all. A widely acknowledged defect across the entire submarine force that the Navy's own Ordnance Bureau stubbornly refused to officially admit for months. Even as commander after commander, Morton, loudest among them, documented the failures in patrol report after patrol report. On multiple occasions during that patrol, Morton was forced to surface and finish off crippled Japanese ships with deck guns simply because the torpedoes meant to do the job wouldn't detonate at all. Morton and the Wahoo continued into a 5th patrol near the Aleutian Islands and a 6th into the Sea of Japan that summer, still sinking ships despite the ongoing torpedo problems, still clashing periodically with fellow officers, including one, a more senior submariner named McMillan, several years older than Morton and clearly resentful of the younger man's meteoric rise, who complained to Vice Admiral Lockwood that Morton's missions were chaotic and poorly planned. Lockwood, unconvinced, pointed out that the results spoke for themselves. At the time, the second most successful war patrol of the entire conflict, trailing only a later run by O'Kane's own USS Tang. Lockwood, by contrast, had taken to calling Morton Mush the Magnificent, and stood by him firmly through the criticism, even as Morton's increasingly public complaints about defective torpedoes began embarrassing the same ordnance officials who insisted, against all available evidence, that nothing was wrong with the weapons at all. The Wahoo's luck ran out on what would have been its 7th war patrol, after reporting 3 ships sunk in the heavily defended La Pérouse Strait, the narrow, shallow passage separating Japan's Hokkaido Island from Russian-held Sakhalin, one of the most dangerous stretches of water any American submarine operated in during the entire war. On October 5, 1943, the submarine went silent. A scheduled check-in on October 26 never came. By November 9th, Lockwood was forced to declare the Wahoo overdue and presumed lost with all hands aboard. The wreck wasn't located until 2006, when a joint research expedition finally confirmed her final resting place. Post-war analysis of Japanese records suggested the Wahoo had likely been damaged or was leaking oil before the final engagement, and that a Japanese aircraft spotted the telltale slick on the surface, leading an anti-submarine attack directly to her position beneath the waves, before the crew ever had a real chance to escape. Lockwood reportedly blamed himself for years afterward, having genuinely believed Japanese anti-submarine forces weren't sharp enough to catch a boat under Morton's command, regardless of how much risk Morton himself was willing to take. Both Lockwood and O'Kane spent much of the rest of their careers privately advocating that Morton deserved the Medal of Honor posthumously, arguing his overall combat record more than earned it. It never came. A combination, by most accounts, of the lingering shadow from the Buyo Maru incident and the number of senior officers Morton had genuinely antagonized along the way with his blunt criticism and refusal to play politics. Richard O'Kane went on to take command of his own submarine, the USS Tang, and became the single most successful American submarine commander of the entire war, by ships sunk, eventually receiving the Medal of Honor himself for actions during Tang's final, catastrophic patrol, when his own boat was sunk by one of its own malfunctioning torpedoes circling back on itself. He credited much of what he knew about aggressive, effective submarine warfare directly to what he'd learned serving under Mush Morton, the officer once judged too cautious and too timid for the job, who ended up rewriting the entire doctrine of American submarine combat in less than a year, and who never got to see, or receive full credit for, exactly how far that doctrine eventually carried the men who came after him into the deepest, most dangerous waters of the Pacific War.